Hello, my name is Lindy Lou Boyette. Thank you for joining our symposium, Advances in the Assessment of Individual Symptom Expression, Dynamics and Course. So sorry that we're not able to meet you in person. We were definitely looking forward to coming to Florence, but we're very glad for this opportunity to present some of the work. I've got two speakers for you today. First, Adela Isvoranu from the University of Amsterdam. She will be presenting on symptom dynamics, on network models in schizophrenia, and she will showcase some results from a study of short and long-term effects of cannabis use on psychotic symptoms. And second, Joni Mihura from the University of Toledo. She will be presenting on an assessment measure, namely the RPAS, which is a new standardized measure for assessing thought disorder through verbatim speech, originally based on the Rorschach. Sorry to say that Marieke Pijnenborg from the University of Groningen and Frederike Schönberg from the University of Amsterdam will not be able to present this time, hopefully next year. So both Adela and Joni will address some questions at their end of their talk. They will also supply their contact info. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact them. Thank you for your interest, and Adela, thank you for your talk. And Joni, thank you for your talk. Take care.
Hi, my name is Joni Mihura, and I am a professor at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio, USA. I'm going to be doing a talk today entitled RPAS, a standardized, meta-analytically supported measure of disordered thinking and visual perceptions using the Rorschach. Before I do say much more, I do have a disclosure statement in that I'm part owner of the company that publishes the RPAS test manual and associated products, excuse me. There's our website and the cover of our manual. I'm new to the Congress, and I was really looking forward to meeting people and of course going to Italy, and I was even starting to try to learn Italian a little bit better. But now I have another year and a half. I'm kind of late in life creating a new area of expertise in psychosis. I'm the Rorschach developer that was tasked, or I guess I volunteered to develop the short form of Rorschach specifically to assess psychosis using the two scores that we'll talk about today. It's called the Thought and Perception Assessment System. So the purpose of this presentation is to sort of introduce a new, less than 10 years old, Rorschach system with meta-analytically supported psychosis measures and international age-based norms. The main focus is going to be on disordered thinking with less focus on visual misperceptions. And then I'll talk a little bit about current and future directions and a Q&A, of which I will also be interested in your questions as well. So I will provide my email. Note that in general, there's many more words on the slides, and I will say on some of them that you could use as a subsequent reference. So the general use of the Rorschach, the past couple of decades, the Rorschach has been intensely scrutinized, leading to substantial empirical improvements, including our test RPAS, which was, I was one of the research council members of the previous test version, Exner's comprehensive system that was started in 1974. He died in 2006 and left the test to his family. And I have a chapter here that's a reference that describes that. And so the research council members put into sort of fast forward action a lot of the improvements that we were already working on. One of those were the validity meta-analyses of 65 test variables in Psychological Bulletin that I took the lead on, which was a very large project that took several years. These scores that I'm going to talk about have excellent inter-rater reliability, and they've been revised and updated with international age-based norms, and for clients, report the results and standard scores, which you can see in Appendix A. The composite measure of the two types of scores I'm going to talk about has shown in the meta-analyses to differentiate with a large effect size, psychotic from non-psychotic patients. And this research is also, importantly, it replicates across culturally across many countries. And I have in Appendix D some references for those non-US replications of these findings. The scales are shown not to be associated with sex, gender, ethnicity, or adult educational level. And for, as you'll see, kids and adolescents, we have age-based norms for them. But, you know, even before the meta-analyses, the Rorschach critics there's several quotes of where they've said that they think that the psychotic measures work well. Here's one quote: "There's abundant evidence that two kinds of Rorschach scores are related to psychotic disorders." And many people may not be aware of that. I think many people think that the criticisms were across the whole Rorschach, but they saw that there were a lot of support for these scores. And also their concern at the time was the norms. And we now have new norms, which they have said that they, I guess, put their stamp of approval on. So the two psychosis scores are disordered thinking and visual misperceptions. You can see where these lie in a structural model of psychosis, the visual misperceptions in the reality distortion section, and the disorganized thoughts in a disorganized section that is mainly comprised of thoughts versus behavior. As you know, psychosis is the psychopathology most reliant on clinical judgment, given the very nature of psychosis. The person's difficulty understanding and accurately reporting their symptoms either during the interview or by standardized self-report questionnaires. Self-report alone overestimates the presence of psychotic symptoms. And I also have some findings with MMPI-2RF showing small effects in Appendix C, small effects in relationship to clinical ratings. So schizophrenia researchers emphasize that speech is more likely to become disorganized when conversations are unstructured. Therefore, the research measures in general that assess disordered thinking and try to provide various ways that the patient can engage in spontaneous speech. Of the couple of largely different kinds of methods of assessment, one of them is the structured interview that can rely sort of on a range of relying more on the person's self-report to rating behavior, to also including other kinds of external information external to the person's self-report and to the interview. Standardized tasks, there are inkblot responses and storytelling measures. But in general, the broadband psychosis interview measures can classify them into using a single item to assess thought disorder, to using multiple items. Some criticisms of the single item scales, for example, with the BPRS, has been that there's no standardized administration and that it's just a single item, and that this could account for some of the inconsistencies across neurobiological findings that use this measure. Also, the instructions in interviews are rather non-standardized. For example, the TLC says during some time the patient should be permitted to talk as long as possible to observe his speech during this condition. The patient should be interrupted at some time in order to see a higher response to this. Also, the interviews vary in assessment method by how much they rely on self-report, and the SIPs and the CARMs are rated both on the person's self-report and behavioral observations, and it can be unclear how much one or the other is relied on. So, multiple item disordered thinking measures based on a standardized task. As I mentioned before, these are using the Rorschach and storytelling tasks. The TDI, the Thought Disorder Index, has been used in a lot of research studies. Some people who are psychosis researchers who are fairly new to the scene may not know that this also uses the Rorschach. And then, of course, there's our RPES codes, the storytelling task by the Kitty Formal Thought Disorder Rating Scale, and the TLI can use either the Rorschach or a storytelling task. So as stated by the lead article in Schizophrenia Bulletin on thought disorder, Hart and Lewin, the Rorschach lends itself well to thought disorder assessment as it is relatively a standardized technique that allows respondents to interpret and structure the task freely, minimizing administration variability, while maximizing individual response variability. So, how do you use a standardized measure to assess disordered thinking when you're supposed to let the person, you have sort of a fairly unstructured way of speaking? So the Rorschach, because the ink blots are ambiguous forms, it's kind of like the topic is kept neutral. We're not showing them images that are clearly of like a table or a person or interactions between two people. But the cards then are structured by a standardized administration that everybody uses that can then be compared to norms. Just a quick slide on, as I mentioned in the previous slide, standardized administration used by these tests, and RPES having validity meta-analyses, norms for adults, and also age-based norms for children and adolescents from age 6 to 17. What is the Rorschach? It is not a psychoanalytic or Freudian test. Even Rorschach himself said the test cannot be considered a means of delving into the unconscious. The main US Rorschach systems in the past half century are not based on psychoanalysis. And so, scientists, we shouldn't succumb to the popular layperson's idea of the Rorschach. They hear sometimes from colleagues like, isn't that test not valid, or they still use that anymore? And what's really, I think, sad is that because of the criticisms, kind of got lost in the wash, that the Rorschach is actually a good measure for psychosis, and as I said, is used in the TDI. This is just a table showing you that Herman Rorschach in his book, Psychodiagnostics, includes many tables of data. It was an empirically based book or test manual. So the Rorschach, and these are focused on RPAS, administered 10 cards with inkblot images. And in RPAS, we asked for 2, maybe 3 responses. The first phase is to answer the question, what might this be? The second phase is to explain what about the inkblot made it look that way. The responses are recorded verbatim, and we have formal guidelines in our manual with numerous benchmark examples for practice. And coding is entered into a scoring program that calculates and presents results scores. So what are the RPES variables? The names for the scores have unfortunately lost their connection with the broader field of psychosis. You'll see on the next slide, they're called WSUM6 in the previous system and WSUM-COG in the current system, which really means nothing to anybody except for somebody who's a Rorschach person and knows what that means. So I'm going to try to correct this in this presentation, and I also have a manuscript I'm working on that is ready, very close to being submitted, that also describes what I'm saying in this presentation. So let's look at the disordered thinking codes and compare them to the categories of the TLC. So in this slide, what you'll see is on the side here are the Rorschach variable names in the TLC categories. There are 3 Rorschach scores on this page. And what you'll see with the definition here is that this is an overarching score for deviant responses, meaning that it deviates away from the task, or in the TLC, deviating away from the topic of discussion, has many different kinds of scores, whether it's tangential to the question, whether the person becomes derailed as they're speaking, they completely lose the loss of the goal, what they're talking about. But these are simplified. You don't code for each one of these, but it is a multiple item because you code for deviant responses across all the responses on the Rorschach, which are an average of about 24 responses per protocol. Deviant verbalizations are using a wrong word or phrase, either a real one or a made up word. In the TLC, these also had different categories, and we don't distinguish in the Rorschach until it comes time for the interpretation. Neologisms, though, which will be coded as a higher level, more problematic deviant verbalization. Peculiar logic is like logicality in the TLC, where a logical reasoning is used to justify the response. I won't read all these, but I've got responses here from the RPES manual, from the TLC and the TDI, from the RPES manual, the deviant verbalization, an ancillarian vestige pig, a deviant response for, this is from an NGR patient and RPES administration, a crusty head or a kid's face. You ever heard of that band? big star across the forehead with the white by the eyeballs, and they can't be quiet. So they can't be interrupting anything. Maybe they are interrupting something, but they can't find anything meaningful to talk about. The person also goes on to ask if the blot is pressure sensitive. Illogicality, some examples from our past. This is the log and this is the insect. Not knowing how ugly they do get. It's an insect because he knows he's pretty good looking. Looks nice. A couple of more simple ones. Must be a man and a woman because they're two. Some sort of simple, concrete reasoning. And also some reason that just does not make sense, and that's why it's illogical. It has to be kidneys because it's next to the horse. Also on the Rorschach, for RPES and the TDI, because of its visual nature, you get thought disturbance scores that are unique to the visual nature of the task. In general, these have been referred to as combinatory responses. And some examples here are a butterfly carrying a hippo, a rabbit with poisonous smoke coming out of its eyes, or when things are superimposed on each other, a bat superimposed on a fish, or someone is seeing a bat and they're describing a fish, but it's at the same area of the blot, and sort of like a condensation response. So like card 10 here, this is where the response came from, where the client saw the rabbit with poisonous smoke coming out of its eyes. The person was also looking very close at the card. It's like they're investigating it vigilantly. You can see as you get closer to the card, this does look more like a rabbit. There are his eyes and the smoke coming out of them, but the combination is bizarre and unrealistic, and also implies some sort of danger. Combinatory responses from the RPAS, I'll just read this one. This is from a case of emerging psychosis from James Kleiger in a case study book that I cite at the end of this presentation. Two girls, surprised, they look like they have worms coming out of their heads, and she also adds the worms like they're rotting. These are the areas in which that the teenage girl saw the response. So these scores are calculated, they're summed across the responses, but they are also weighted for level of severity. So for example, using the wrong word, a biography lab gets a lower weight, whereas girls with rotting worms coming out of their heads gets a higher weight. These are calculated into two scales that are plotted on the standard score output. And one of them is the funny name I referred to earlier called the weighted sum cog, where it's just the weighted sum of the more benign and the serious ones. And the other one is just the serious cognitive codes. In the meta-analyses, this score was shown to differentiate psychotic from non-psychotic patients with large effect size differences. And since that time, there have also been studies that have targeted disordered thinking validity criteria in particular, like the PANS conceptual disorganization scale. So I've got 3 studies cited here. This last one, you'll note I have in yellow, was also Kirsten Buckingham, who's my first year student, was planned to present at the Congress, but her poster is online and you can access that information in the poster section of the Congress. So I also mentioned that there was a second supported RPAS psychosis measure of form quality, but I will just return back to what I was saying. You know, what is coded on the Rorschach for thought disorder or disordered thinking, it is the thing that you are trying to assess. It just uses some more simplified scoring categories, which makes scoring more simplified for the person who's having to score the test rather than having to put them in the different categories. And so I think that's important to know. And the scoring is simplified, but it is then summed across responses. So it's not just one rating. And then it is weighted for severity. And so it is the thing that you are trying to assess is what we're coding. It's not some leap of interpretation. The other score based on form quality is a behavioral test of visual misperceptions. There's no interview measure that's exactly the same, but I'll show you more about what this score is on the next slide. But I will say there's some fMRI research on unique perceptions on the Rorschach. I won't read all this, you can read it later. But essentially what they're finding is that these kinds of scores is where kind of like if somebody is seeing a hallucination, they're seeing it where it overrides the contours of their environment, and they see something that is really coming from their head. And so this is what form quality scores are doing, is it is something that is more personal to the person, is overriding the contours of the blot, and you get a response that doesn't fit the contours. How do we determine that? There are form quality tables that are based on the frequency of perceptions in very large samples, plus added to that judgment of fit by international judges. All of the responses have been rated by an average of 10 judges, and the fit to which it fits the contours. Although often people with psychosis are so perceptually disordered that they're not in the tables. This is just an image to show you where you can look up the numbers of the scores. This is an example of one. This is the image you saw with the rabbit and smoke earlier. Inverted seahorses. That's a more common response. But what about hands clapping and two people dancing? If you look at that, that's not in the table. It doesn't really fit the contours of the blot. And so whatever is on your mind is sort of overridden what's showing there in the ink blot. This also is supported in the meta-analyses and another subsequent study. It also, interestingly, is associated with the rubber hand illusion in another recent study. We also have on our website lots of neurobiological and fMRI studies with the Rorschach, also looking at the mirror neuron system, replicated in many studies with the human movement score. And interestingly, this visual misperception of the rubber hand is not associated, in fact, the opposite direction with self-reported symptoms. There are also studies showing that clinical high-risk patients have similar form quality minus to people diagnosed with psychotic disorder, and more elevated than non-psychotic patients. When keeping age a constant, the CHR patients were actually CHR seeking services were similarly elevated on the thinking disorder scale as patients diagnosed with psychosis, and more elevated than non-psychotic patients. What's on the horizon for RPAS? As I mentioned, we are creating a short form to assess psychosis that I described more on this slide. We're dimensionalizing the existing disordered thinking scales. Instead of just having levels 1 and 2, we have 6, 0 to 5 ratings of severity. We're developing an app for speech-to-text administration that should be ready, predicted in 2 or 3 months. We're also developing a remote administration app, given the COVID-19 situation, that has 3 equivalency studies that we're now preparing to submit the IRB, so we can see if the norms are equivalent in the remote administration. We're also going to be investigating automated speech sample scoring to see if it is as good or better than the hand-scored variables. And there's a new grandiosity scale that we want to know if it replicates with delusional grandiosity. So for the Q&A questions, we've had the question before without all of this background reading. People have asked us, why not just use the TDI? In general, if you've used the TDI or you know the scoring, it's a very complicated. There are many different categories, so the scoring is much more complicated. It takes significantly longer. And of course, it's a research measure. There are no norms like there are for the RPAS scores. Isn't the amount of training needed prohibitive? Is a good question. And as you probably know, a lot of the measures that are used to assess psychosis and emerging psychosis do involve a lot of training. And so, you know, we are not expecting everybody to learn RPAS, but, you know, there are definitely areas in which it can be more useful, and that is with assessing psychosis. So it is considered a special area of training, and that if you are already trained, though, you can just currently code for the cognitive codes and the form quality scores. And also to address the time, like I mentioned, we're developing a speech-to-text app, the short form TPAS, and maybe the automated disordered thinking coding. We're hoping that could save time in scoring, but we are not implementing that yet. My new student who's going to be joining this year, she's going to be taking over that project. If you wanted to learn more about RPAS, what are some of the resources? I've got a lot of resources here. I won't name them all, but there's a podcast by me for an introduction to RPAS and the testing psychologist. There's a brief chapter that's free through Guilford that I've posted also at ResearchGate. We have webinars, 2 in English coming up and 1 in Italian. Lots of training materials for instructors. The RPAS manual is also in English, currently translated into Italian and Japanese and Portuguese, and a casebook that myself and Greg Meyer, who's the first author of RPAS, and also my husband, using RPAS. If you have any questions, you can contact me. There's my email there. I'll be very happy to answer questions, or if you want to see on our library webpage through RPAS, we have lots of articles that are available for people who have an account. This is especially helpful for people who are clinicians in non-US countries who may not have as much access to PDFs as universities do here in the US. Also for clinicians who may not have access to library PDFs. And the next slides also contain the appendices I referred to earlier and all the references that I referred to in this presentation. I'm about to run out of time. I just wanted to thank you and to say grazie, ciao, and I hope to see you next year.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this online talk titled Cannabis Abuse in Psychosis, From Short to Long-Term Impact on Symptomatology. I'm Adela Isvoranu, and I am a PhD candidate within the Psychological Methods Research Group at the University of Amsterdam, and I will be giving this talk today. I think it's really a shame that we cannot all be together and that there cannot really be a discussion at the end of this talk. So what I'm going to try to do is to keep a few minutes at the end of the talk where I'll do a Q&A, and I'll think about some questions that would commonly be answered at a conference and on the topic, and then I will try to answer these questions, and hopefully I will be spot on. Okay, I will begin with a short overview of this talk. I would first like to introduce a bit of network perspective to psychopathology, and that is because the current study is carried out within a network frame. Then I will discuss a bit about clinical applications, and a very important point, at least a point I find very important, the integration of environmental and genetic risk scores into network models. And then I will move on and talk a bit about our study, the rationale, methods, and results. And I will finish the talk with some future outlook and some consideration. All right. By now, quite a lot of people are already familiar with the network perspective to psychopathology. And also, I think a lot of people are familiar with the common framework in which we studied mental disorders so far, which is the common cause framework or the disease model. And within the common cause framework, what we do is to assume that we have an unobserved variable, which we usually call a latent variable. In this case, I'm going to use the example of schizophrenia. And we assume that this variable, this unobserved variable, causes certain symptoms such as paranoia, delusions, hostility, and so forth. And an important assumption of the model is that symptoms hang together only because they are caused by the same latent disorder. And once we remove this latent disorder, then the symptoms will also go away. So we assume that the symptoms are interchangeable, and the only reason they hang together is because of the latent. In recent years, network models have become quite popular, and the network framework or the network approach to psychopathology. And within the network framework, the focus kind of shifts away from the latent level to the level of the symptoms. And within the network framework, the main assumption is that the symptoms actually have causal power to trigger each other, and also that they can directly influence each other. So for instance, if you think that the patient has some paranoid symptoms, or he or she thinks that they're being followed by somebody, then that might lead to a lot of anxiety in that person. And then that person might decide, for instance, not to go out of the house because they think they are being followed. The moment they go out of the house, they would get hurt. So the anxiety would lead the person to socially isolate themselves, and then they would spend days after days after days inside the house, looking out the window, being scared. And eventually, this will feed back into the person's paranoia and sustain the paranoia. And these kind of feedback loops are something we observe very often in clinical practice, and clinicians align very well with this view. And I think that is one of the main reasons the network approach has grown very, very popular, at least I would say in about the past 5 to maybe even 10 years. And this is actually quite updated now, but there are many papers currently using this methodology, and I think this is quite strong evidence of its popularity. All right, in terms of clinical applications, there have been many clinical applications to date. I showed you already the list of the outdated list of publications using network models, but network have been applied to the field of comorbidity, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, depression, autism, suicidal behavior, insomnia, eating disorder, psychosis, and I think many more that I didn't get a chance to list here. And I put psychosis as the last one. It looks like a very small part here, but actually we all know that it's a very, very big field. And it's also the field of my research and, of course, the topic of this conference. This is one quote from 1972 that I personally like very much, and it reads as follows. We are optimistically hopeful that the current massive research on families of schizophrenics will discover an endophenotype, either biological or behavioral, psychometric pattern, which will not only discriminate schizophrenics from other psychotics, but will also be found in all the identical co-twins of schizophrenics, whether concordant or discordant. All genetic theorizing will benefit from the development of such an indicator. And one of the reasons why I really like this quote, it's because we could very well read it in a book today, or in a chapter today, or in a paper today, and think that, oh yeah, that's true. So it applies very well to the current times. This calls our attention for some reconsiderations. So I'm going to show another quote that I also really very much like, which states, for the past 20 years, we have been biding time and asserting that certain ideological information is just around the corner. We still wait. A reconsideration of our basic strategies and fundamental assumptions. And the reason why I really like this quote is because I think it calls towards new methodologies and new ways of thinking and embracing new approaches. And I think we live in a time when that is happening more and more. And I think that's great. Moving further, while so far I focused on the symptoms and talked about the symptoms, and the network models are focused on symptom interactions, of course, there is so much more to a disorder than symptoms. So we know that the environment can play a very important role, the genetics, of course, and that has been a very important part of my research, focusing on ways in which we can integrate other variables within network models and study the associations between symptoms, environmental risk factors, and genetic risk factors, and so forth. So I'm going to take a bit of time to also discuss about this before we move forward. If we think about the external inputs, this is how I'm going to address whatever is outside of the symptoms. So risk factors, environmental factors, genetic risk factors, and so forth. So if we think about the external influence on a common cause, then we would usually look for risk factors for schizophrenia. And we would say that there is a genetic risk for schizophrenia, or there is or cannabis use is a risk to develop is a risk for the onset of schizophrenia. However, if we think about the external influence on the network model, and we no longer look at this latent level, then what we can think about are risk factors for symptoms. So maybe a genetic risk plays a more important role in making a person liable to developing paranoid symptoms, while cannabis use may have an impact on anxiety and might make a person more prone to develop anxiety symptoms. So then what we would do is to look for risk factors for symptoms, risk factors for a disorder. From a network perspective, you can also think about the external influence on an engine. So maybe cannabis use makes the association between anxiety and social isolation to increase really fast. So if a person normally is anxious and as a response to their anxiety, they immediately socially isolate, this effect may be even faster, stronger if that person starts smoking cannabis. So it's a pretty different perspective and a pretty different way in which we think about external influences on the network model than the way we think about external influences on the latent variable. Okay, moving forward, I will talk a bit about the background of our study, our methods, and then our results. Okay, so it is quite widely known that substance use disorders, especially cannabis dependence, they are common comorbid diagnoses among individuals suffering from psychotic disorders. And we also know that these are quite complex processes. So there is some evidence that cannabis may exacerbate positive psychotic symptoms, cognitive impairment, and medication side effects. But there is also some evidence that cannabis use may have some beneficial, if we can call them that, effects. For instance, through lowering negative symptom scores, especially in cannabis-dependent patients. At the same time, there is still quite a lot of debate of whether cannabis may play a role in the onset of psychotic symptomatology, or whether it's something that comes after the onset of psychotic symptomatology and that has an impact on the development of symptomatology. I think generally it is accepted that cannabis may worsen the outcomes of psychosis, but the pathways through which this happens are still quite unclear and debated. And most studies carried out today, they are carried on some scores, and they don't really focus on individual psychotic symptomatology. So what we tried to do within our study was to actually sort of zoom in into the symptoms and then investigate what kind of associations there are between cannabis use and psychotic symptomatology. And for this, we used network. The manuscript is still in preparation, but hopefully will be available within the next few months. All right, moving on to the methods section. We use data from the Genetic Risk and Outcome of Psychosis project, and we looked at patient data from the second wave of data collection. And after being all missing data, because the methods used cannot handle missing data, we ended up with a sample size of 603 patients, all diagnosed with a non-affective psychotic disorder. We used the positive and negative syndrome scale, the PAMS, and then we looked at current cannabis use, as well as at cannabis use intensity within the past month and also within the past 3 years. To construct the network, we used a mixed graphical model, which is an undirected network structure. And within this network model, A missing edge indicates that two variables were independent after conditioning on the set of the remaining variables. To control for any spurious associations that may result from sampling error, we use regularization, specifically the Lasso regularization, and we selected and our tuning parameter was selected using cross-validation. And because cross-validation can often be variable based on the random seed, we decided to try and be a bit more conservative. And then to avoid this variability, what we did is our results reached across 1,000 network structures. So we estimated 1,000 network structures every time using a different cross-validation seed. And then we only included within the network the edges that showed in more than 90% of the included cases. In the network structure, a green edge indicates a positive association and the red edge indicates a negative association. Moving on to our results, here is the fixed network structure, which looks at current cannabis use. So here in the middle, we have the current cannabis use node, which is a yes, no, and it's a measure taken from a urine test. So whether the patients tested positive or negative to cannabis. And what we can see is that current cannabis use is associated with conceptual disorganization, grandiosity, hostility, and poor judgment, and that is a positive association, but also negatively associated with stereotyping. Moving forward, if we look at the past-month intensity of use, again, we have both positive and negative connections, this time more connections. So cannabis use past-month intensity was associated positively with conceptual disorganization, grandiosity, depression, and poor judgment, and negatively associated to stereotype thinking, guilt, and poor attention. And finally, we looked at the past 3 years intensity of use, and then what we can see again is that we have even more connections, most of which positive. So past 3 years intensity of use, cannabis intensity of use was associated to conceptual disorganization, grandiosity, paranoia, depression, poor judgment, and poor impulse control, and negatively associated to anxiety, guilt, and mannerism and posturing. And I think this is quite interesting because it gives a bit of support for both in both directions. So it seems that cannabis use is indeed associated with many of the positive psychotic symptoms, but also there is some evidence of cannabis use being negatively associated, especially to the negative symptoms and especially to general psychopathology and also to negative symptoms. What we also see is a dose increase response here. So it's likely that maybe using retrospective measurement and looking at the intensity of use over a more extended period of time might give us some more insights than just looking whether a person is using cannabis currently or not. So there is some evidence that retrospective measurement might carry out some more information. Okay, a bit on the future outlook of this. I would like to highlight some methodological notes. So there has been quite some debate recently on the specificity of network models. And what I think this is actually not a very big issue in general, because if there are specificity problems, usually you see this in the very small edges in the network that most researchers are in fact not inclined to even interpret. It can be an issue for some lines of research, especially the ones focused on discovering small edges, so for instance, bridge symptoms or this kind of environmental edges. So what I'd like to highlight here is that I focused a lot in the study. I focused here on the idea of exploratory research. So we looked at these associations in an exploratory way, and I think in that case, we would prefer specificity over sensitivity because you'd rather have everything that is in there rather than miss things. So yeah, I think that's something to keep in mind, of course. And also, I think another important aspect, especially with this line of research where you try to identify bridging links between symptoms and other external factors, usually the effects between variables from the external field of a symptom, such as environmental variables, genetic risk scores, they will likely almost always be smaller than the effects between the symptoms themselves. So the symptoms will always associate or more highly connect to each other than they connect to outside variables, which I think makes a lot of sense because, well, symptoms are always highly correlated to other symptoms. So that's also something I think is important to keep in mind when we look at this kind of networks, and that's also one of the reasons why I used this kind of visualization to highlight the associations, because here I wanted to focus on cannabis use and other symptoms. Okay, so I think we need further methodological developments, which are aimed more towards integrating environmental and genetic risk score into network models. I think it's really interesting to look at symptoms and the symptom interactions, but we do know that there's a lot more happening in that, so it would be great if there would be more methodological developments in this respect, and also ideally, eventually, we will have more integrative treatment approaches where we can combine subjective assessments with more complex and objective behavioral and physical data, and also maybe a move towards theoretical modeling, so focusing more on modeling theory and seeing how we can intervene on a theoretical model. I think these would all be some really nice steps forward in the field. We have a Facebook community. It's very popular. We have a lot of members. It's called Psychological Dynamics. And there are many questions and many answers and a lot of friendly people in the community. So I thought this can be a great opportunity to share it with you. And if you are interested in joining, please follow the link. And this is me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. Okay, let's move to the Q&A session now. One question I very often receive is the question, could you explain what the advantages are for using network analysis compared to regular correlation analysis? And I'd really like to highlight that what we see in a network structure, it's not correlations. We could see correlations if that's what we want. So QGraph, the software that we use to plot these network structures, you can give it as input a correlation matrix, and then you can get as output a network only with correlations. So that's possible, but it's not what we do. But what we do is in this slide here. So we are basing our analysis on partial correlation structures, but actually we are using machine learning techniques, such as the lasso regularization, to control for spurious associations, and to try to reduce the type 1 error. And also what we see in the network structures are conditional associations between variables. So a missing edge again means that we have two variables which are independent after conditioning on the set of the remaining variables. And I think it's really, really important to keep in mind and to understand that a network structure doesn't equal a correlation analysis. Okay, another common question that I receive is why are the edges not directed? So if you remember in the example that I introduced, actually the edges between paranoia, anxiety, and social isolation were directed. But in this case, in the network structures that I'm introducing here, the edges are directed. The edges could also be directed. We have statistical methods to do that. They are called directly cyclic graphs. But one shortcoming of using directly cyclic graphs is that we assume acyclicity. And I think this assumption in psychopathology simply doesn't hold. And in that case, personally, I prefer to talk about directed graphs. And it's of course a shame that this doesn't give us a direction, but I think they are better aligned with the kind of interactions and associations that we see in psychology and in psychopathology. One thing here that I haven't yet showed you is that actually within these network structures around each node, we have a small circle that's either fully filled in or partially filled in. And this is called predictability. So this tells us for one node how much the nodes, the neighboring nodes predict that node. And in this case, we see that for some symptoms, the circle is quite full. So this means that that particular symptom can be predicted by its neighboring symptoms and the symptoms to which it's connected. But for the case of cannabis, what we see is in fact that it's pretty empty. So cannabis is not well predicted by the symptoms in the network, in which case one way of interpreting this is that the effect moves from cannabis into the symptoms. Of course, this is exploratory and hypothesis generating, and from cross-sectional data, we cannot infer this direction. But it is one way to think about it. All right, that was it. I had addressed two questions that I think are usual and very common, commonly asked at conferences. But of course, if you have more questions, I would be really happy to try and answer these. You can contact me by email. I have my email address here on the slide. Yes, I hope you enjoy this talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and stay safe.